The 2019 Summer Institute in Migration Research Methods provided 6 days of training in the use and analysis of migration data at Penn State University, targeting early career scholars. The Institute drew local and national experts to train attendees and provide on-site mentorship. Most participant costs were covered thanks to an award from the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
So thanks for having me and thanks for inviting me. So today I'm going to discuss how to create longitudinal data sets of immigrants and their children using US censuses and other administrative data. Just like today, in the past we also had a mass nativist wave, right? There's this idea that the Southern and Eastern Europeans were going to be unassimilable. They weren't going to be able to make it in the United States, and this served as the narrative to justify closing the border or introducing the quotas in the 1920s to limit the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans to come to the United States, right? And this idea of whether or not immigrants of the past assimilated or integrated into US society has sort of captured the attention of many researchers as well, trying to understand whether or not or how long it took these groups to integrate into US society, right? But the prior research that's been able to do this has used these pseudo-cohort methods to study mobility, or they've looked at cross-sectional data. But we've really needed these longitudinal data sets to track immigrants and their children over time to really assess how long or whether historical immigrants ever became into the mainstream, so to speak, right? And so some people have tried to create these longitudinal data sets by matching people by hand, right? So this takes a lot of time. It's very expensive because you have to pay research assistants, right? And et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, how can we build these linked data sets needed to ask and answer questions of international migration where we don't have to spend years and years and years matching small samples, but instead we can match full populations over time? So the recent digitization of all the historical censuses, of the complete count population censuses, and advances in computing power have allowed us to start tracking or creating these large historical panel data sets of immigrants and their US-born children. So after 72 years, the US Census Bureau releases all of its full count censuses. And through a partnership from Ancestry.com and various research institutions, they're subsequently digitized. And so what we can do with that digitized data is we can begin tracking immigrants from one census to another census, and then also find their children and track them from one census to another census. Using this idea, there's been sort of an explosion of research that has begun to understand or using these linked historical data to understand various aspects of the immigrant experience. So people have looked at the starting points of immigrants whenever they enter the United States. They've compared Italian immigrant trajectories in the United States and in Argentina because other countries are also digitizing their data. However, when we link historical records, we don't have unique identifiers of individuals, right? All this data predates Social Security numbers, and there's nothing that would allow us to follow individuals from different administrative sources, no numbers that would allow us to follow people across administrative sources. So instead, we match people with their name, their first and last name, their year of birth, and their country of birth, or place of birth, or state of birth, right? And this introduces various challenges to following certain populations over time, right? So let me just give you what the underlying data look like so we can better understand how we're creating these census links. And then I'll tell you how we actually do it, right? So this is Augustus Frey's 1910 census record, right? So Augustus was born in Germany. He's living in Litchfield County in Connecticut. He's working in a grocery store. He's married, he has a son, he arrived in 1893, he speaks English, right? And so we have a lot of information about Augustus from the 1910 census record, right? But we might want to know what he's doing 10 years from now, not just understand what he's doing in the 1910 census record, right? So what we do is we take his name, his age, and his place of birth, right? And then we find him in the 1920 census, right, using the same information. So Augustus is now no longer living in Connecticut. He's living in Massachusetts. He's not working in a grocery store. He's working in a lumber mill. He's still married. He still has a son. And he still has various characteristics that we can find in the 1920 census, right? He's naturalized. He was also naturalized in the 1910 census. And so there are many problems that sort of affect our ability to be able to match these individuals over time, right? One issue is that there's a common name problem. So there could have been multiple Augustus Freys in the 1910 census, and we wouldn't have been able to match these individuals with confidence to the 1920 census because we wouldn't know which Augustus Frey was the correct person to match. Similarly, if they have the same age, the same birthplace, it's very hard to discern or to tell who we can actually match with these individuals. Another problem is transcription error and nicknames, right? So if Augustus's name was misspelled, it would be difficult to assess whether or not he's the right Augustus Frey that we're matching to, right? If he's going by August or Gus, it's also difficult to determine whether or not we're matching to the correct person. And there are many other problems as well, right? We have enumeration error. So enumerators took the census and they found it difficult to write down foreign names often. And so it's sometimes hard to find names that way. We have transcription errors. So the ancestry just may have screwed up in terms of creating the data sets. There's mortality between censuses. There's return migration, so people return home. We can have under-enumeration of certain populations, especially recent arrivals. Then we have the age heaping problem, right? So people round their ages to the nearest 5 or 0, and so that makes it very difficult to know what age they actually are. And people with the same attributes make it really difficult to follow individuals over time. And so because linking is inevitably imperfect, we're not going to be able to match every single person and every single family line over time, right? They're going to have to be unique, and they're going to have to accurately report their name, age, and place of birth over time. When we're creating these matches, right, we need to consider various things, right? So we want to reduce the number of false matches. We don't want to match the wrong people to each other, right? If Augustus Frey accidentally matched a completely different Augustus Frey, that's bad. We don't want to do that, right? But we also want to increase the number of correct matches that we create, right? So we want to create as big of a data set with correct matches as we can, but we don't want these false matches whenever we're considering who we're going to link over time, right? And so there are various ways that we do this. What you do when you link by hand is you have researchers use these characteristics, the name, age, and place of birth, and then you match the individuals using various websites like FamilySearch.org or Ancestry.com, right? And then you can match individuals or sets of individuals to different data sets, right? It's slow and costly, but you can people usually feel a little bit better whenever they have humans doing these matches rather than have computers do the matches, because computers can over-apply the different rules that we link. But you can't link tens of millions of individuals using hand matches, right? So the second way that we can match people is using automated algorithms, right? So with the automated algorithms, we can generate links with computers that we can replicate across different data sets. And it's much cheaper and much faster than linking by hand. The algorithms that we use generally follow different rules. And these were developed by, through a series of papers by Ron Abramsky, Lita Bustan, and Catherine Erickson, right? So they use these rules that were initially described by Joe Ferry in an early work where he is hand matching, but he laid out the logic behind the rules, right? And so what the algorithms do is they follow 3 basic rules. So first, we clean the names in the data set, right? We remove non-alphabetical numbers, so there's like question marks and random things in the censuses. And we also correct for misspellings and nicknames, right? So Gus would become Augustus, August would become Augustus in these typical matching, right? Pete becomes Peter in these types of algorithms, right? And then we restrict the sample to those who are unique by their first and last name, their implied year of birth given their age, and their place of birth, which is either state or country in the first data set. And the reasoning behind that is because if there are multiple people with the same name, age, and place of birth, we're not going to know who to necessarily match to over time. Right? And then we actually perform the match. So for every person who's in the first data set that we're trying to match, right? First we look for an exact match. So is there only one person in data set A and data set B that has the same first and last name, age, and place of birth? If there's only one match, then we consider them as matched. However, if there are multiple matches, then we discard them from the sample, and that's because we won't know which person to actually match to. If there are no matches, then we try within plus or minus one age band, and then we try within plus or minus 2 age bands. And then generally we stop, but some people you'll see actually go to 5-year age bands because of this age heaping problem that we have, right? And so if there's one match, whenever we're doing this, then they're included in the final data set. However, if there are multiple matches, then they're discarded from the sample, or if there are no matches, then there are no matches. They're not in the sample, right? So we can't necessarily find everyone in every single data set. But then there are some other researchers that are also trying to change the matches to be immigration specific. So with everything else we can actually do for the entire population, but some immigrants have some specific needs in terms of matching as well, right? So Dylan Connor has figured out that in Ireland, you can match people back to Ireland given what their last name was. So last name is very tied to certain geographies, or not all last names, but many last names are tied to certain geographies in Ireland. And so he can get an idea of where you're from given what your last name is to reduce measurement error. There's also people trying to do these root name matches. So people Americanize their names, which makes it hard to follow them as well. So if Giuseppe starts going by Joe, right, we wouldn't be able to match him using these other algorithms. But if we match to the root of the name, then we can also try and match them that way, right? So Joe DiMaggio doesn't actually match unless you match to the root name because he was born Giuseppe, right? And so all of these alternative approaches generally follow the same rules, right? Clean the names, then limit it to unique names, and then match based off of those age bands as well. Here we have 3 names, Willie Anderson, Catron Donath, and Michael Brennan, right? And in the 1910 census, we have a set of potential matches for each individual. So just take 1 second to think about who you would match, or who you think would match, if anyone would match, in this particular example. So the first thing we need to do is we need to standardize the names, right? So Willie, Bill, William, and William all become William. Then we need to allow for age misreporting, right? So he's 15, in theory he should be 25, right? But that could be within certain age bands, right? And then we have systematic name changing that we need to worry about, right? So Catron Donath should match here, is what someone was saying, but actually she got married, right? And I know this because I have her oral history, and so that's why I know this is actually the correct match. And so we can't actually follow her because she changed her last name. And then the other issue is if they reported, or the numerator in 1900 reported Michael Brennan, but really his name was Michael O'Brien, right? We'd want to maybe standardize these names, and then it would be difficult to match him. The only person that we'd be able to match in this particular case is William M. Anderson, and that's because we know his middle name. If we didn't know his middle name in both censuses, we wouldn't have been able to match him, right? So matching can be very difficult, right? There's a lot that we have to consider whenever we're trying to match people, and we end up losing a lot of the population whenever we are trying to do this, right? And so the question is, who actually matches if so few people, it seems, match, right? Well, people who are unique by their name, age, and place of birth, because that's the characteristics that we're actually saying you need to be able to match for, right? But there are different characteristics that make you easier or harder to match. right? So people misremember their age. Certain populations change their names, right? They Americanize their names over time. There's fluid and changing borders in Europe during this time. A lot of immigrants are actually in the United States because there is a lot of changing borders during this time. That makes it very difficult to know where they're actually from, right? If you're born in Poland, you may not necessarily know if you're from Prussia or if you're from Russia or something like that. And so it's really hard to actually report where you were born, right? We also follow men in general. However, with oral histories and death records, that's how we get their maiden name. We will be able to match women soon, and this is all being digitized now, so eventually we'll be able to do this, right? But if you're poor, Black, Asian, or Native American, it's harder to match you. And that's because there's just poor enumeration in the censuses of these populations, and enumerators were very bad at writing down people's names, which makes it harder to match these populations. And so because we lose individuals across the censuses, right, we need to consider issues of attrition bias, right? So all demographic longitudinal data sets have attrition bias, and this isn't any different. So we do need to still consider these types of issues whenever we're matching people across censuses. Right? And so this is from a paper that I wrote that just came out, right? What I did is I took a 1910 match to the 1920 match, right? So in 1910, this is only non-citizens, because I was interested in the economic advantages of citizenship, right? So in 1910, there were 1.8 million non-citizens born in Europe, 1.8 million men, non-citizens born in Europe. And then I matched them forward to the 1920 census, right? So some people became citizens, some people didn't become citizens, which is what I was interested in. And we see that I was only able to match 24% of the population forward to the 1920 census, right? And so there are characteristics that make it harder or easier to match. For instance, if you weren't literate in 1910, right? I can only match 20% of those people to the 1920 census. However, if they were literate, so this is they could read or write in any language, right? I can match forward 26% of individuals. But the question was, does the match population end up looking like the target population that we're trying to understand, right? And so if we look at occupation score, so if you're interested in economic outcomes, the only economic variable we have in censuses prior to 1940 is occupation. And so what generally you'll see people do is they use what's called the occupation score, which takes the median income of every single occupation in the 1950 census, then applies it to the detailed occupations in all of the censuses across time, right? So it's pegged to one specific year. This is just a way to economically scale occupations. Right? But we see that the match population, right, is concentrated in occupations that pay more than the target population of the 1910 and the 1910 census, right, by about $637 and $2010. You can convert these into $2010, right? Right? And so we see that the match sample does a little bit better than the non-match sample, or than those who aren't matching, right? And so we do see some biases in terms of what we end up with in terms of looking at percentages compared to the target population. So generally what we do is we just reweight the sample based off of characteristics that make it harder or easier to match. I have yet to see reweighted sample change any results that we actually produce with these, but it's sort of good practice to do, right? And so because we have a lot of algorithms, there's a lot of questions about what works best, what should we worry about which algorithm we're actually using. Right? In the end, what we want to do is we want to do social science, we want to do sociology, we want to do economics, right? We don't necessarily want to just continually worry about who's actually matching, right? We want to create a full paper. Well, in a recent paper by Abernetsky et al., right, they actually went through every single linking procedure that they actually could, and they compared it to a hand link. So they used the 1950 Iowa State Census, and they matched it forward to the 1940 census by hand, and then using all the algorithms. And then they used some Civil War records that they matched forward to, right? And they find that all algorithms tend to find similar people, although the computer algorithms find fewer people than the hand-linked samples, right? And they find that all algorithms produce the similar estimates whenever we're actually running regressions, right? So we can kind of feel good that that actually happens. But the best practice is to use multiple algorithms just to make sure that it's not the match that's driving your results, it's actually a real result. Once we become confident with our matches, right, we can begin asking questions, right? What we actually want to try and do. So we can study previously unknown phenomena. There's all sorts of weird things in censuses. In 1930, they asked, do you own a radio or not, right? And so you can find weird variables to sort of study, right? You can also bring in this new data to bear on old debates. We've been discussing what happens to historical immigrants for a very, very long time, since the 70s and 80s, right? And so we can actually enter these debates and try and assess who was right, who wasn't right. But we're not limited to passenger records and censuses. There are other administrative data sources that we can use that have built-in panel data sets, right? So one is Mexican border crossing records. So border agents originally were at the border to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act. However, beginning around 1908-ish, they began collecting these border crossing manifests where they'd write down information of all Mexicans who are coming over the border, right? So this included various demographic information, such as who they were traveling with, what their occupation was, how much money they were coming with, whether they're going to come for a long time or whether they're going to return to Mexico. It also gives their skin complexion, so light, medium, or dark. It gives how tall they are. It gives whether they have any marks on their face. Usually it's just like a mole or a scar on their face, or if they're missing an arm, then they'd write that down, right? It'd say where they're born in Mexico, right? And so we have a lot of information that we can then connect to the US censuses of Mexican immigrants, right? Using these Mexican border crossing records. Or we have naturalization records, which have this built-in panel data set, right? So you came as a non-citizen, you had to declare your intent to become a citizen, right? Which is this form on the left. And then 2 years later, you could petition to become a citizen, which is this form here, right? And so you get, with intention forms, all of this information, right? Where you're from, mostly demographic information. And then we know everything about you 2 years later that we can assess too. We know your occupation. We know who you know because you had to have character witness statements. We know all of your children, right? Both born in the other country and in the United States, right? And so we can build panel data sets. So there's a really good paper that looks at name changing. So when you naturalize, you can change your name. And they're looking at the economic effects of name Americanization. So if you change your first name to an American name, it presents a 14% premium in the labor market over time, right? And so there are various ways that we can leverage these different administrative data sets that we don't even need to connect to the census if we don't want to, right? But we can because we have their name, age, and place of birth. And so there's a lot of sources of data that is coming out. Most has been digitized. Some is currently being digitized, right? That we can begin connecting to different sources, right? So we have censuses that are coming out that you can download off of IPUMs, right? Ireland, Norway, England, Sweden, Argentina, and Mexico have various censuses that we can now connect to, right? And we have other administrative data like passenger records, border crossing records, church records, war records, mortality records, personnel records, right? Naturalization records, right? Anytime we have your name, age, and place of birth, we can find you. And we can get all your data, right? And so if you want to do these coding, if you want to do the coding, we have all the codes up on Ron Abernetsky's website. So you don't have to recreate the wheel, right? And so he's updating these with all the most up-to-date approaches to doing all these machine learning, or all these machine matching approaches. And so you don't have to recreate anything. It's all there for you. You can download it really easily. They should be user-friendly. I hope they're user-friendly anyway. And so you can get them from this website, right? And that's what I have. All right. So.
Thank you for watching. Please watch the other videos in the series using the links below.